If you know me, you know that I have a somewhat noticeable affinity for the pink tide, a wave of leftist leaders in Latin America that push for an ideology known as socialism of the 21st century. I've made a couple of videos about them here and there, one of which being a podcast where I put them on a tier list. But since it's been a decent while since that podcast, there have been a couple of changes here and there, so I figured, hey, why not re-examine the pink tide leaders and give their ranking a more proper video? But before I do, I have to address one major thing. I know there's a bit of a discussion in regarding who and what counts as a pink tide leader. The wikis have had a pretty decent number of edit wars regarding a lot of subjects and semantics, despite the fact the definition is pretty clear in my honest opinion. A political wave and turn towards left-wing governments in Latin America throughout the 21st century. But I've seen a lot of people argue about some specifics. Do they have to be a member of the Sao Paulo Forum? Is New York District 14 a member of the Pink Tide because DSA is a member of the Sao Paulo Forum? Do we draw the line at certain ideological leanings, or does every single
left of center
political leader elected in the 21st century count? What if the person was initially elected as a leftist and then transitioned away from it after getting elected? Do they count because the initial election had them as a left-wing candidate, or does their shift take into considerations? That second question, in my opinion, should be really obvious, but no, apparently it's not. Some count, some don't. And what about leaders of countries that are not technically Latin America, but also have some ideological leanings towards pink tide governments? Do they count? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I'm one of the primary reasons that there is even a disputed section on that Wikipedia page, because there's so many people that just kept adding people that are just like, no, they objectively don't count based on the page's definition. So when brainstorming this video idea, I actually decided to put it to a poll. And you all said that you just basically want me to go over all the people on the Wikipedia page. Treat them as if they're all members of the Pink Tide, even if they're not necessarily Pink Tide members. Although I will still be making sure that you know which ones are Pink Tide, which ones aren't Pink Tide. However, I will be making some executive decisions. No Bernardo, no Claudia, and no Orsi. It is way too early to rank any of them due to the fact that their administrations have basically just started as of the day I'm recording this. No Gabriel Serville, as French Guiana is not an independent nation, and as much as it pains me for a completionist to say, no Kenny Anthony and no Philip G. Pierre, as I can't find any information about their administration, positive or negative, and if I were to talk about them, I'd want to at least have some evidence or information to give you, which I can do for literally everybody else, even if it's minuscule. With that, here is the definitive ranking of Pink Tide leaders and their friends. Number 35, Daniel Ortega. Daniel Ortega is a reactionary authoritarian despot. Literally whatever the Sandinista ideology represented during the revolution is dead, and Daniel himself killed it. He is a socialist in name only. If it were up to me, this guy would not be anywhere remotely associated with Pink Tide. The man has literally not been a leftist by any means since 2001 as a ploy to get elected, shifting into reactionary Christian beliefs, even Jew-baiting an opponent of his, threatening that he would hang like Judas. But even his shift towards Christianity was a complete lie, because the second that Christians became critical of Ortega, bye-bye Christians' rights. And since his second stint into office in 2006, he has slowly consolidated power to the point where he is basically a dictator. Like, for real, there was a constitutional amendment that was literally just passed in Nicaragua that not only extended Daniel Ortega's term, but literally gave him complete control of not just the legislature, but also the Supreme Court, the police, direct control over all the different municipalities. Like, basically everything that Daniel Ortega did not directly control, he controls now. He's jailed and deported basically every single person who has opposed him, even if they come at it from a left-wing perspective, such as the case of when during
2018
he wanted to raise taxes and cut benefits to social services. Very socialistic of him. But then when students decided to protest against him, he decided to counteract them, claiming that they were CIA plants trying to coup him. You know, similar to how a lot of right-wing autocratic regimes make the claim that a bunch of left-wing groups are trying to use like their pressure to try and get these young groups to try and organize against them. But he said the magic buzzword, so it's okay apparently. He downplayed the COVID pandemic because it would make him look bad, and he has multiple sexual assault allegations from minors, including one from his very own stepdaughter. The man literally became the thing that he wanted to destroy. And there is literally nothing worse that you can see than that. Oh wait, I forgot to mention the fact that his wife is technically co-president, so she technically counts as pink tide apparently. Well, okay, just copy and paste this segment but replace Ortega with her. Number 34, Pedro Castillo. Pedro Castillo was a very strange individual. He started off as a revolutionary fighter against a communist group, would then end up becoming the leader in a teacher strike, propelling him to become the presidential nominee for a different communist group, went from being a fringe candidate that nobody cared about, to making it to the runoff against the daughter of a dictator, would run a fierce campaign in the general election as an anti-communist, then once getting into office, shifted so far to the right that his own party expelled him, and despite this rightward shift, the right-wing Congress hated him so much that they tried to impeach him twice, and when they were on their way to impeach him a third time, he tried to initiate a self-coup eerily similar to the one that his opponent's dad did back in 1992, which resulted in him finally being impeached and removed from office. I mean, is there really much I can add to his story than that? I'll admit, when I first learned about Pedro Castillo, I wasn't exactly too enthused with his election, considering not only his very reactionary social views, but also the general election pivot being so strange. But, you know, maybe he would surprise me. Maybe he'd prove me wrong. Some people told me that he just sounded right-wing just to get elected. And even very early on, there were some things that he was doing that's like, okay, this doesn't sound that bad. But every day in his administration, he just kept doing things that proved my initial concerns right. Now, you could argue that Pedro Castillo was doomed to fail since the beginning, and I'd even agree with you to an extent, but from my perspective, all I saw was a guy that I didn't trust show why I shouldn't have trusted him. I mean, his pivot was so bad that even his VP doesn't even get counted as pink tide. Number 33, Nicolas Maduro. A man who by the law of the Venezuelan constitution should not be president right now, because the Venezuelan constitution actually explicitly bans vice presidents from seeking the presidency, with this ever so noticeable issue plaguing him ever since. His administration has been complicated at best. He's clearly not like his predecessor, and a lot of things have happened that show that a lot, despite his many attempts to make himself seem like the worthy successor that he was pitched as. While yes, we have to acknowledge the fact that the US sanctions have not exactly helped Venezuela, other aspects of administration have not been doing so well either. A major point of contention being the consolidation of power by PSUV, and while not necessarily on the same level as Daniel Ortega, elements like the party banning opposition candidates who were likely to beat him from running for dubious reasons, and taking over other parties that were critical of him in order to get an extra ballot line, don't exactly paint Maduro as this huge lover of democracy. Oh yeah, and there was also that time that he tried to annex the Guyana Essequibo region, and also the time that he threatened that there would be a civil war if he lost the 2024 election, a threat that reigns very similar to a person that he allegedly hates. Maduro, to me, is basically very similar to Joseph Stalin, the protege of someone who, even if you could criticize them, had somewhat good intentions in what they did. Meanwhile, they saw power and easily ran to it. Number 32, Ollanta Humala. I'm starting to notice a pattern here. Authoritarian, Peruvian, authoritarian, Peruvian. Funnily enough, we could also use those two words to label Humala. Ollanta actually comes from a prominent political family, and despite the fact that they went in very different directions in regards to partisan politics, they all espouse the same ideology, ethnosacercism, a very strange political ideology that would probably be best described as indigenous fascism, but in a bit of a third positionist style. Right-wing social views, seemingly far-left economic views. Now, the funny thing is, when you see that, and then you think this guy got elected president, you're immediately going to start getting really, really anxious. But funnily enough, what ended up actually happening was this. Ollanta basically ran as an extremely far-left figure, who made a lot of the Peruvian establishment worry, considering he was associating with some very radical political figures, and promising all these big changes to Peru's economy. And then when he ended up actually getting elected, he basically just ran a neoliberal government. This is the kind of stuff that I was talking about at the beginning of the episode, where we have people like Ollanta, Castillo, and Ortega that somehow managed to can still be considered members of the Pink Tide, but then we have other people who have very similar views like this, like Lenin Moreno, and somehow they don't get counted. Where do we draw the line? Number 31, Luis Abinader, the first disputed member. My guess being the fact that the party leans more towards the center of center-left, but the party also is a member of the Foro de Sao Paulo, but he has also received a lot of aid from Western business heads, with even Mike Pompeo showing up to his inauguration, which probably has a hand with the Abinader government being a bit more right-leaning than most other Pink Tide-aligned governments. And one of the biggest things that shows this is his borderline indistinguishable immigration plans from Donald Trump. His 2024 re-election bid being solely based on fear-mongering about Haitian immigrants and plans to construct a border wall between the two nations. Another thing indistinguishable from Trump is the dinero. Abinader apparently being worth $76 million and having suspicions of tax evasions thanks to the Pandora Papers leak. Again, if it were up to me, he wouldn't have been here, but you all voted, and the wiki says that he should be here, so not much else I can do about that. Number 30, Laurentino Cortizo. Another one with some disputes. The only things I knew about him before was the fact that he came from the centrist wing of a center-left party, and that he obviously used bots to rig a Twitter poll that I made. So now let me do some research into what Cortizo actually did in his administration. From what I've seen, Cortizo is basically the epitome of a politician, basically serving as a technocrat, and people from Panama do not like that, as he has had many protests towards his administration against rising costs of living, corruption, as well as copper mining in biodiversity zones and indigenous peoples' lands. Some of that was due to the fact that he came in during the COVID pandemic, then the Russo-Ukraine war, but the man would end up being so bad that his party would end up getting 6 in an 8-person race. Hey, wait a minute! Number 29, Danilo Medina. A disputed Dominican leader, Medina is a relative mid-ranger for most of his administration, usually focusing on things like infrastructure, schooling, reallocating the tax burden from the poor to the rich, generic good things that a social democrat would do, but these are some things that drag him down. 1. His closeness to bad elements in the USA. 2. Massive corruption under his administration. And 3. Him passing a law known as Sentencia 168, a judicial ruling stating that the children of all immigrants residing in the nation born after the year 1929 were not citizens, which took away the citizenship status of 458,233 Haitians residing in the country, which exacerbated tensions between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, which will be further exacerbated by his political rivals. Yeah, he's pretty below mid. Number 28, Leonel Fernandez, Dominican Republic's first left-of-center president. And unfortunately, he's only the best comparatively. He laid out his goal during his first term by simply stating, "We could be the Singapore of the Caribbean," with all 3 of his terms being considered good for the Dominican economy, one of which was sorely needed as one of his successors literally led the country to financial crisis, which is generally good, but in the more generic economic growth way, not like the prioritizing of social programs way. Another issue came from the fact that Leonel has faced multiple corruption scandals, being accused of embezzling tons of money. Like I said, only best comparatively. Number 27, Martin Torrijos. Another Panama disputed person. Torrijos is interesting due to his history, being the bastard son of Panama dictator Omar Torrijos. Similar to many of the other disputed people here, he's basically below average. The dude aligned himself with a Christian Democratic Party during his administration, showing he was a lot more right-leaning. He raised the retirement age, but as a consultation, would increase pensions. The only slightly base thing I could find from his administration was him leading a delegation to fight for Puerto Rican independence. Which probably makes sense considering his past. While I'm more of a statehood guy for practical reasons, anything is better than being in the Commonwealth. Otherwise, again, nothing really too notable. Number 26, Evo Morales. Evo was the first explicitly socialist president of Bolivia, and he sought to completely reform his nation. Literally, his nation changed its constitution and was reformed during his administration into a plurinational state to help the indigenous population that were always left behind, extending that support to all the disadvantaged in his country. He increased the minimum wage of his country by 50%, decreased the pension age from 65 to 58, gave people up to the age of 25 basic medical coverage, raised the Bolivian social security payments, and eliminated illiteracy in his first year. He broke the chains the World Bank and the IMF had on Bolivia, rejecting it and other forms of Western imperialism. In order to pay for the programs that he was pushing, he would push for the nationalization of resources, but also maintain a record of environmentalism to prevent them from going overboard. Speaking of, one thing Evo would do in that regard was legalize and industrialize the cultivation of coca due to the religious, cultural, and pharmaceutical uses, rejecting one of its other uses, which would of course lead to the West to target Evo Morales massively, ultimately succeeding in 2019. You might be looking at that and thinking, man, he sounds like he should be way higher on this list given the notoriety of his administration. He should probably be top 3 at least. Yeah, he probably should be top 3 at least. And maybe at some point he would have been. But there are 2 things that drag him down massively. 1, his seeming inability to let go of power. After he passed a constitutional 2-term limit in the middle of his first term, he had the court rule that he could legally run for a 3rd term, then had the court rule against term limits in general so that he could try to run for a 4th term. Then, while in exile, he forced his party from picking a charismatic figure like him into simply picking a background cabinet minister that he could puppet around. Then, when that guy refused to be puppeted, he would go on a massive tirade against him, trying to take back power, despite the fact that the new court said that he is not able to, destroying not just the politician that he built up, but also the party he built up in order to continue a vanity bid so that he can claim he is the only true figure that can maintain the Bolivian experience. And you want to know why the court is really running against him now, despite the fact they were so running for him before? Well, that's not only because he's now constitutionally ineligible to run for re-election due to the fact that they are re-implementing term limits, but also due to the fact that Evo Morales is currently under investigation for statutory rape. And despite being given multiple chances to clear up the record and clear his name, he has instead decided to reject it and just move forward as if nothing happened. Yeah, I just can't really rank him that high with those 2 things into consideration. Number 25, Ralph Gonsalves. Another disputed member from the country of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Comrade Ralph's plans focused heavily on making this small nation notable on the world scene, and his plans were seemingly successful enough for me to actually give him a ranking in the video. First, let's look at the bad thing. He supports the death penalty. Now let's look at some positives. He has really pushed hard towards infrastructure, particularly roads and hospitals. He served as a mediator in the Guyana-Essequibo conflict, trying to get Maduro to de-escalate the situation, and focusing primarily to fix the economy of his nation, usually through shifting from agriculture to tourism, And although I'm not the biggest fan of using this particular model to judge an economy, the year he went into office, 2001, the country's GDP was around $428 million. Now, their GDP is right around $1 billion. For a country with only around 111,000 people, that's actually pretty impressive. Number 24, Luis Guillermo Solis. The Citizens Action Party is defined as a social democratic party, which has led to some people to argue for its inclusion, which puts him as a disputed one. Solis broadly did center-left social democratic stuff, pushing for social programs to lift people out of poverty, alongside pushing for social issues like civil unions. His programs were praised by the World Bank for lifting many Costa Ricans out of extreme poverty. Granted, the fact that this particular group praised him probably also adds him into the disputed category, with many others regarding his nation as being one of the fastest growing economies at the time period, with his administration also being praised a lot for its response to Hurricane Otto. But not much else to can really add. Number 23, Carlos Alvarado Quesada, the 48th president of Costa Rica. He was also a well-known social democrat, but a lot more of a modern-day one, maintaining a lot of aspects of the neoliberal economy of the country, which led to many strikes happening under his tenure. But his age also made him seemingly be somewhat different than traditional politics in a sense, wanting to bring some major reform to the nation. One such attempt being when he wanted to decarbonize the country's economy. But outside of that, there's really nothing else I can really give him. Nothing too bad, but nothing that impressive either. Number 22, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the two-time president of Haiti. Aristide went into office with some very good ambitions, increasing the minimum wage, self-sufficiency in regards to food and the economy, even proposing that France repay Haiti $21 billion in restitution for forcing them to pay for the Haitian Revolution. Very impressive ideas, unfortunately not being able to be implemented, considering that led to France and the US to team up with Aristide's opponents to depose him in a coup, putting an end to everything that he could have done for Haiti, with the repercussions of that action still being felt in the nation today. Why he's disputed can be a range of both ideology and the definition of Latin America, with a lot of them not including Haiti due to the fact that it was colonized by the French. Number 21, Manuel Zelaya. Mel would do something interesting when he first ran for office, initially pitching himself as a liberal conservative that was common in Honduran politics, but when he would end up getting elected, would take a massive shift to left, to the anger of the Honduran political elite, who would begin a war with him. One of the biggest things that showed this was when he got into a conflict with the Honduran media, which was mostly controlled by political opposition, who would exclusively give him so much negative coverage that he would order 2 hours of state-sanctioned media coverage to counteract the misinformation of the news media. But what would end up really getting him in trouble was when he was talking about reforming the Honduran constitution in 2009, which the Honduran opposition claimed was Zelaya trying to end the one-term limit of the president, leading to the Honduran military to do a coup against Honduras so bad that even the United States had to condemn it. They didn't do anything about it, but they did wag their fingers. By the way, you wanna know what's the first thing the opposition did once taking over the country? They passed a law ending the one-term limit. So you're telling me they weren't actually honest about their intentions? Huh, who would have guessed? So unfortunately, Mel didn't really even get a chance to do anything for Honduras before he was expated, but he would end up having the last laugh. Number 20, Fernando Lugo, a Catholic priest that ended a 60-year reign of conservative rule. Similar to Zelaya, he pitched himself as a bit more moderate, running as a Christian Democrat, but soon revealing himself to be a liberation theologist, coming into office wanting to do many big things. He wanted to make healthcare universal, he implemented school meals, he wanted to give students laptops free of charge, initiated a deal with Brazil to sell surplus power from their hydroelectric plant to divert into public infrastructure. However, Halfway into his term, his parliament and vice president stopped working with him and began making baseless claims of corruption and began an impeachment inquiry into him, gave him only 2 hours before the proceeding to defend himself, then immediately voted him out of office, with cables that were released by WikiLeaks stating that this was planned literally in year 1 of his term. So we got to do a little bit more than Zelaya, but doesn't help him that much. Number 19, Alvaro Colom, the husband to the woman who almost killed Guatemalan democracy, all because she is so unpopular. Does it have anything to do with his tenure? Well, he did leave office with a 95.83% disapproval rating, so there's probably some precedent in that. Colom was a well-known social democrat. As such, he was good, but wasn't great. He did push for a decent number of social programs, like Mi Familia Progresa, which sought to alleviate poverty, as well as Bolsa Solidaria, which were bags of food supplies that were directly given to people to relieve malnutrition, but he did have some restraint into other ideological aspects. The biggest one being the death penalty, trying to veto a law that brought back the death penalty because it was condemning us to another greater death penalty, but then stating that if people were sentenced to death in his administrations, he would do literally nothing about it. Which is kind of cringe, but still, he did do some good things. But considering he's basically in the same tier as people who were impeached before they could actually do anything, doesn't really paint him in that good of a light. Number 18, Ricardo Lagos, the first left-of-center president in Chile since 9/11. And boy, did Lagos make an impression even before going into office, openly calling out Pinochet on live TV, where he basically let out everything that he was holding in for the past 15 years. When he went into office, he sought to reform Chile to be more democratic and peaceful. And one of the major things he did was try to right many of Pinochet's wrongs, not only declassifying many documents associated with his atrocities, but also wanting to give financial assistance to the victims, also pushing for an unemployment insurance policy to combat the rising unemployment levels that were coinciding with the beginning of his term. But Lagos was more of just one of the beginning steps into transitioning Chile away from the Pinochet era. A step that was needed and a step that was better than the previous ones, but still just a step. Number 17, Dilma Rousseff, Brazil's second left-wing president since the incident. She mostly served as a continuation of the previous administration, which should mean that they should be closer, right? Well, while she did oversee a minimum wage increase and pushed for maintaining a lot of the social programs that were going on at the time, Dilma suffered some stagnation in stuff like the economy, which, if it didn't trickle down to hurting the poor, maybe she'd be better liked, but unfortunately, it seems like it did, leading to 2 massive protests against her, one brought up by public transportation prices, and the other brought up by what would eventually be her downfall, Operation Car Wash, an investigation into the state-run petroleum industry, Petrobras, which culminated in a multi-nation investigation, which led to the downfall of multiple incumbent administrations, which can be a criticism of her, but she's not that bad. She's just also not particularly that impressive. Number 16, Gabriel Boric, Chile's millennial libertarian socialist president. There was a lot of hype for his run, and Boric seemed like a really good candidate. Not only was he a member of the activist movement in his nation before transitioning into public service, he was also able to self-criticize, pointing out the flaws of Nicaragua and Venezuela. He also acknowledged the role his country had in the modern-day systems of the world, stating very simply, if Chile was the cradle of neoliberalism, it will also be its grave, with his first step being the replacement of the Pinochet-era constitution with a new one, a constitution which, according to all metrics, was one of the most progressive constitutions ever. I honestly can't go in depth about what this constitution had, but it is really impressive, and it seemed like everyone was ready for change. But then for some reason, it was rejected in a referendum, which led to Borch basically saying, alright guys, back to the drawing board. Alright, Constitution number 2, baby. Wait, hold on. This one's written by the Chilean right wing. It was literally more friendly to neoliberalism. Shockingly, it was also rejected. And by the time this happened, Borch was already in the lame duck session of his tenure. So there's nothing else he can do on this issue. Okay, did he do anything else of note? Well, he did reimburse some victims of violence by the Chilean police during the protests. He ended relationships with Israel. But he also continued a conflict with the Mapuche people, even though he himself was critical of his predecessor doing the same thing, which really doesn't help him that much. He stopped Chile from doing fascism too, at least for 4 years. But, I mean, there is literally nothing else I can give him because he failed in the one thing he set out to do. Number 15, Alberto Fernandez, our first Peronist on the list. And if we wanted to be very technical, Fernandez probably shouldn't be on here because under a technicality, he is a federal Peronist, which is considered a more right-wing version of Peronism. As such, he wasn't able to do that much in regards to combating the economic crisis that Mauricio Macri left him, which led to Argentina to make a very huge mistake. But where Fernandez did shine was in regards to his social policy. He would give out debit cards to the poor to be used for food, created the Ministry of Women, Genders, and Diversity, legalized abortion, allowed for alternative gender identities in legal documents, and legalized the self-cultivation of medical marijuana. Another element of praise is his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, being able to do a swift lockdown and a vaccine rollout, leading to a 1.3 fatality rate, while also making sure that people weren't left behind by giving them a $700 billion peso stimulus. Number 14, Tabaré Vázquez, the man who, for all intents and purposes, is the reason why the term pink tide even exists. Vázquez beat a 174-year conservative streak in Uruguay, serving 2 non-consecutive roles in the presidency, being considered more of the softer, more reformist wing, a la pink instead of red. During his first term, he would raise the minimum wage by decent amounts while decreasing poverty by similarly decent amounts. His second term would have more ramifications, both good and bad. He expanded coverage for housing, created the Ibirapita program, which would help older generations adapt to the modern day through technology, created a plan to help preserve archaeological and ecological wonders, and pushed for pro-trans legislation. However, there was one thing in his administration that was regarded as a failure, and that was when he tried to find petroleum reserves to nationalize in the nation, when Uruguay didn't have any petroleum to reserve. So he just started drilling in the country to find some. Unfortunately, he didn't find anything. Look, it's bad enough to drill for oil, but when you drill to look for oil and find nothing at all, you just wasted everybody's time. Number 13, Mauricio Funes, the first left-wing president of El Salvador, which of course made the right wing scared, fearing that there would be a massive influence from another country. What came instead were a wide array of social programs to help the poor, abolition of public healthcare fees, giving both stipends and jobs training to the extremely impoverished, and publicly declaring the end to discrimination based on gender and sexual identities. One area that Funes focused his attention on was education, raising the salaries of the teachers, pushing harder for programs to combat illiteracy, and introducing programs that gave kids free shoes, uniforms, and meals. Another big thing that happened during his administration was how he treated the legacy of the Salvadorian Civil War. He would not only formally apologize on behalf of the government, but also create a pension plan for everybody who fought in it, including the left-wing guerrilla groups. Pretty good. But he also did launder tons of money from the government into his personal bank accounts while he was in office. So, can't really put him much higher. Number 12, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, Argentina's second most powerful woman in history, CFK, would similarly become controversial. While most of her policies were continuing the political success of her predecessor, she did have some elements that made her unique. Early in her administration, she nationalized the state pension system in order to help people get their needs met without having to raise taxes. Another prominent social program she had done was the Universal Child Allowance, where the government would pay unemployed parents to help raise their kids, which would slowly expand to the underemployed and other people in need, with her programs being attributed to dropping poverty by 5.6% and extreme poverty by 30.8%. CFK would also renationalize the largest energy firm in the nation, crafting a system where the national government would own 51%, while the states would own the remaining 49%, with the major goal being completely severing the economic ties of the IMF to promote borderline autocracy. One element not focused on economics is her continuing the investigation of human rights violations, including sentencing 2 people who almost got away with it, and trying to properly identify the 500 children of leftists that were kidnapped and given away while their parents were in prison. However, she didn't get to do a lot more due to both problems in her personal life and clashes with the political opposition, neither of which you can really blame her for. Number 11, Luis Arce, Bolivia's second leftist president, and the first one since, And Arce seemingly served as a strange mix of return to normalcy and radical change, basically serving as literally just doing
Control-Z
to everything that the coup plotters tried to do after they deposed Evo. He brought back the Wefala, returned a $327 million loan to the IMF so that his nation would not be indebted to the West, increased wages and other benefits, rebuilt ties to the rest of the pink tide, created a permanent wealth tax on people who made more than $4.3 million, and directly punished the people who did the coup. Speaking of, he would end up facing a coup in his own right after a general named Juan Jose Zuniga was mad that he couldn't kill Evo Morales, the two even engaging in a verbal match against each other, with Arce seemingly having to go through a lot of the same problems that Evo had to go during his administration, with only one difference. One of his opponents is Evo, who spent the entirety of his administration basically saying, Arce is a traitor, Arce is a traitor, Arce is a traitor. The only way we can continue my legacy is to support me in the next election, when the only reason Arce is president right now is because Evo was afraid that a charismatic figure like David Choquehuanca was going to be the president instead, and he wanted a pencil pusher that he could manipulate behind the scenes. And when he found out Arce wanted to actually be president, he got mad, going on to adopt every single talking point that the opposition used against him when he was president. But don't worry, Arce's used to removing tumors. Number 10, Rafael Correa. Correa is sometimes considered the fourth musketeer of the pink tide, and I can kind of see why he can claim that title. He went in with an idea of the citizens' revolution to free Ecuador from the control the West had over them. He opposed the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, shocker, what else is new? He raised the minimum wage, made a deal with Cuba to get cheaper medicine in the nation, allowed for civil unions, and increased funding to family planning procedures like the morning after pill. Correa would also make himself known to the world by allowing Julian Assange asylum in their embassy in the UK. And one major thing that is interesting with Correa is the fact that many of his policies directly led to crime in the nation to drop so low that Ecuador was labeled the safest nation in Latin America during his tenure, a thing that his nation is really grappling with now that he's gone, even though the elite blame their faults on him. But Correa has a couple of snags with his outlook. He's pretty socially conservative and wasn't exactly silent about it. The civil union and morning after pill policies were specifically created to prevent things like gay marriage and abortion from being legalized in the nation. Correa even going so far as to state that if Ecuador did legalize abortion, he would resign. And while you can make the case that the nations just weren't there yet, I would argue you need to take steps to make the nation there yet. But he doesn't get dropped that low because he at the very least still understood there were issues that needed to be addressed and actually did implement policies to somewhat address them. Number 9, Xiomara Castro, the wife of Manuel Zelaya, who managed to pull a massive upset in her own right, and with no coup to depose her, she was able to push her plans to turn Honduras into a democratic socialist state. One of her earliest acts was extraditing her predecessor, Juan Orlando Hernandez, for his connections to drug trafficking because she couldn't trust the still corrupt judicial system at home. She personally intervened in a case where a businessman tried to evict the indigenous population, banned open-pit mining due to its effects on the environment, and was extremely bold by declaring that anybody who used under 150 kilowatts per month would not pay any electricity bills, and to prevent any issues from that, she declared that every single cost that had to be paid would be tacked onto the biggest users of electricity, essentially implementing progressive taxation on electricity billing. While that already put her in a pretty good position, what really caught my eye was when she decided to cut all ties with Israel due to their genocide in Gaza, to my recollection being the first Latin American nation to do so, and I'm sure history will vindicate her. Number 8, Salvador Sanchez Cerén, El Salvador's last president before the dictatorship, and what a great send-off to democracy in the nation. His government fought hard to legalize abortions in the case of rape and danger to the mother, also banning child marriage during his tenure, raising the minimum wage by 40%, leading to a 5% drop in poverty. The homicide rate would drop in his tenure from 110 per 100,000 inhabitants to 50, but honestly, the thing that kind of earns him a spot this high is the fact that during his administration, he took a very drastic measure and banned all metal mining in the nation for environmental and public health concerns. And in a time period where climate change is on a massive road to kill us all, we need solutions like this. And naturally, since it's a good policy, fake money president here decided that it would be a good idea to get rid of it. But only after he was able to rig the election so that this guy's party couldn't actually oppose it, with the military intimidating the people who were in there. But that random commenter will still try to claim that me calling it a dictatorship is an overstatement. Number 7, Gustavo Petro, Colombia's first ever leftist president. He entered office intending to upend the Colombian neoliberal establishment, and Petro has had a lot of ambitions with that goal in mind, announcing intentions to curb greenhouse gases by 40% by the end of his term, only being held back by major economic downturns, teaming up with Brazil to save the Amazon, banning child marriage, with only one side being angry about it, pushing for massive reforms in the labor laws by raising wages and making sure the hours worked are fair to the employees, signed a law that allowed for free undergrad programs in the nation, but the one thing that was a cornerstone of his agenda was the Total Peace Program, where the government would stop with the immediate rush to violence to curb leftist groups and seek to work things out peacefully. And while a lot of that is good and great, is it really top 10 material? And the thing that got my attention on him, similar to Xiomara, was his stance on Israel. Also cutting all ties with the country due to their genocide on Palestine, and being extremely outspoken for his support for the Palestinian people, with a slight added new thing with him being one of the first world leaders to oppose Donald Trump on actual policy substance, refusing to participate in his theater in regards to deportations, then literally getting Trump to bend the knee and follow his demands. Number 6, Michelle Bachelet, Chile's first explicitly socialist president since 9/11. With that, she was decently more radical than Lagos, and despite ideological leanings, seemingly more radical than Boric, pushing for a steady minimum wage increase during her term, increasing the country's pension, sent out materials to help educate the lowest income members of Chilean society, closed the wage gap between men and women, pushed hard to better sex education laws, and created a universal healthcare program for the elderly. In her second term, she pushed for a universal secondary education bill, a civil union bill after failing to pass an outright gay marriage bill, pushing for multiple environmental preservations, and legalized abortion after it was banned by Pinochet. Speaking of, one of her biggest things during her tenure would be the protection of human rights. I wonder why a woman directly tortured by Pinochet would be in favor of protecting human rights. Creating the Museum of Memory and Human Rights to document all the human rights abuses done during Pinochet's regime, passing a Freedom of Information Act, and creating the National Institute for Human Rights, which reopened 2 investigations into the Pinochet regime so that more victims can be shown to the world. Number 5. Nestor Kirchner, the first left-wing president of Argentina since, who was also accused of being similar to past presidents of Argentina, the good parts or the bad parts. Well, considering he's in the top 5 of this list, what do you think? Despite barely winning the presidential election, he sought to give Argentina a mandate that they sorely needed. The biggest issue seemed to be Argentina's economy falling, in his mind, thanks to the International Monetary Fund. So Kirchner decided to simply pay off the debt, which led to the Argentine economy to bounce back. But he wanted to make sure that that bounce would actually benefit your average Argentine by renationalizing industries like water, raising wages, and extending welfare programs like unemployment insurance. But much like the previous person on this list, the human rights abuses committed by the not-that-old military dictatorship were to be dealt with, replacing the theory of 2 demons, which blamed the military and the leftist groups for the violence of the Dirty War, to a theory of angels and demons, which rightfully blamed the military and only the military. Kirchner repealing a law that basically gave the government and military amnesty for their actions, point blank saying, no, try them, they deserve to be punished. Kirchner being notable for literally being able to change the entirety of Argentinian politics, with him and the previously mentioned Cristina creating a subsection of Peronism known as Kirchnerism, which somehow translated to making Peronism shift to the left. I mean, that's pretty impressive, not gonna lie. Number 4, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. I'll acknowledge my biases up front. I probably shouldn't have to because the list is already opinionated. But AMLO is kind of the whole reason why this list and this hyperfixation even exists for me. I was a lowly left-wing Chicano who was hoping to find some hope in a world that wasn't so hopeful. Conveniently, there was a presidential election going on in Mexico at that time period. And who should be running than this guy? And I was able to do a lot of research into this guy, and I liked what I saw. And what I also liked was the poll numbers showing that he was going to win in a landslide, giving me hope that maybe something similar could happen in the United States. Well, was I sorely disappointed. Which led me to put a very close eye on Mexican politics. So, in fairness, I was kind of destined to know a lot more about what AMLO did versus the rest of the people on this list. But what did he actually do? AMLO sought to create something called the Fourth Transformation, reforms in Mexico that would be so drastic that they bordered on revolution. Now, did AMLO actually accomplish that? Well, maybe not exactly in the way he had in mind, but he did offer a lot of changes to the Mexican political scene. He technically created a universal healthcare system in Mexico. Its implementation was rocky at first, but it seems like after COVID, he was able to clear things up and make things streamlined. Continuing with that trend, he would also implement other major social programs, increase the minimum wage, create a pension for people 65 plus. While still having an oil-based economy, he tried to maintain a relationship between that and the environmentalist movement through programs like Sembrando Vida, which would also lead to more food self-sufficiency in Mexico. With his previous encounters with corruption in the Mexican political system, he tried to reform it to be more streamlined and prioritize direct democracy, trying in the meantime to allow non-binding referendums on major policy pieces that he wanted to do. AMLO even tried in desperate vain to actually get the US presidents he served alongside to actually come up with a solution to the immigration problem. But since that required actually helping people, that was off the table for us. And due to that fact, AMLO walked into office with slim majorities and walked out with 4 supermajorities. A very impressive showing. Number 3. Jose Mujica, the guy that allowed Tabaré Vázquez to get a break. Mujica is one of the most fascinating people on this list, regardless of your ideology. Former guerrilla fighter turned frumpy old man president. Pepe was seemingly unbothered by what others thought, so he went in a very interesting direction when it came to governance. Recognition of the state of Palestine, a low-income housing project, having an open-door policy towards Syrian refugees, raising the minimum wage from 4,800 Uruguayan pesos to 10,000. But one of the biggest things that he's probably known for, that you are all probably typing in the comments, is the fact that despite his age, he's a very well-known ideological progressive, particularly when it came to legalization of 3 things: gay marriage, abortion, and the thing that he's probably the most known for, marijuana. Not just legalizing it, but even offering a cheap government brand of it. Another prominent aspect of Pepe Mujica was that he was not anything close to both the Western boogeyman of the Latin American left wing, but also him being the complete antithesis to a champagne socialist. Look at him. Look at him. Look at this man. This is what he wore to official presidential meetings. This was his car. This was his house. And these 2 things were during his presidency. And to show another element of his frugality, during his tenure, he was supposed to receive $720,000 for his salary. What he decided to do was take $72,000 and give the remaining $648,000 to help the poor of his nation. Honestly, just incredible. Number 2, Hugo Chavez, the rock that began the wave. Chavez spent his entire political career being the boogeyman of the West. Why was he the boogeyman, you may ask? Maybe this Empire Files video will actually be able to explain why.
So just a quick overview. Not only was poverty reduced by half, but extreme poverty fell from 17% to under 7%. Pensions for the elderly went from under 400,000 to over 2 million. Malnutrition, of course talked about a lot today, fell from 21% to 2%. Unemployment fell from 17% to under 6% and cut the huge infant mortality rate in half. Children in school went from 6 million to 13 million, and illiteracy was totally eradicated.
Oh, that motherfucker! Many of the things that I have praised in the list up to this point were first implemented in Venezuela due to Hugo Chavez's Bolivarian Revolution, using the funds from nationalized oil to push for social programs, a rejection of US imperialism, both invasion-wise and economic-wise, helping the indigenous community, etc. Things that even people who hate Chavez have expressed admiration for relentlessly due to its economic benefits to the nation. While there are a lot of things you can praise Chavez about, there's also a lot you can criticize. Some of them can be explained as products of the environment, like how he was too reliant on petroleum, which led to corruption in industries to, at best, not get better, at worst, getting worse. Others not so much, like the fact that he created a massive personality cult surrounding himself, and set the stage for a more authoritarian guy to take it and make Venezuela into the boogeyman that they thought it was.
To clarify, I understand certain aspects of admiration of Chavez and other leaders in the Latin American left due to long-standing U.S. imperialism, and understand that people get very passionate in their admiration as well. But to a degree what happened with Chavez borders on a new religion surrounding him. I am of the belief that holding the viewpoints of a particular leader to an unhealthy degree is merely just another form of dogmatism that comes with the worst aspects of things like religion, and I am very critical of that mentality. I can understand why it happens, but still have some form of criticism surrounding the practice. When we are at the point where there is literally a version of the Lord's Prayer that replaces God with Chavez, maybe we've transcended something beyond just, oh, they like Hugo Chavez's policies.
Which, for better and worse, can paint his ideological framework of revolutionary socialism in a certain light. But you could also argue that in this particular instance, the ends justified the means. Chavez's Venezuela is a lot more complicated than a lot of people want to give it credit for. And that goes for people on both sides of the aisle. Could Chavez have been better? Absolutely. Could he have been worse? Absolutely. Number 1. Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. The man, the squid, the legend himself. Lula has been fighting for the Brazilian people since the 1970s. I wonder if that reminds me of anybody. Lula not only turned a party that was considered fringe into an electoral powerhouse in Brazil, which after being elected would enact a major economic and social reform. The two biggest ones being Fome Zero, a government program to give Brazilians access to food in order to combat extreme poverty and malnutrition. But of course, the one that everybody in the West talks about a lot is Bolsa Familia, a program that would encourage school attendance, vaccination, and helping the poorest in the country by giving stipends to the poorest of the nation who kept their kids in school and properly vaccinated, which had significant results almost immediately. By the end of Lula's first tenure in office, around 26% of the population would be covered, with the poverty rate dropping 27.7%, child malnutrition dropped 46%, and child labor dropped 4.1%. All while being able to maintain a free democratic state. You can tell why even after many years out of office, the Brazilian people were overwhelmingly ready to bring him back as soon as he was able to run. His current administration is still happening, so it's a little bit hard to judge that, but from the looks of it, he's still kind of just doing the same thing that he did back then. Funnily enough, for a while, Lula and Chavez were actually fighting for the number 1 spot on this list. And while I was already leaning towards Lula getting the number 1 spot, there was one last thing that basically solidified that, and that was the first Lula administration's stances on intellectual property. Not only having his Ministry of Culture openly working out a deal with Creative Commons to reform the copyright system in Brazil, but also through bypassing vaccine patents so that Brazilians have access to cheaper drugs. And it's very rare to see an actual world leader address issues like this, so Lula gets a little bit of an edge on that. And that concludes the ranking of the Pink Tide leaders, and some others. Hopefully this video will have explained to you why I, for the most part, think this group of individuals is actually pretty interesting. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to for when a future video mine comes out. And if you're more content from me, consider supporting me on Patreon.